So, hello everybody. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to open this session on Fiscal Stimulus, Lessons for Europe from the US. It's this year's CEPS Ideas Lab. Good morning to the East Coast. Some of our speakers are in Washington, D.C. Some of us are joining from Europe. I am in Hamburg. Due to creative destruction, we are able to have this as an online event today, and this enables us to invite speakers from East Coast in the US and Europe as well. Fiscal Stimulus, Lessons from Europe to the I repeat it again. Lessons from the US to Europe. I think fiscal stimulus is not a theory, and as most of you know, against the background of the corona crisis and after the elections in the US, the new Biden administration passed a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill and began proposing additional very large-scale economic spending programs. The stimulus packages are controversial, as Larry Summers, for example, pointed out. In 2020, stimulus was twice the size of the output gap. For 2021, he estimates that the stimulus being even 5 times the output gap. Output gap is the difference between GDP, current GDP, total income, and the pre-crisis trend, if you want to say that. Paul Krugman, on the other hand, winner of the Nobel Prize, argued that Bidenomics is as American as apple pie. Today, we have excellent speakers today to analyze the topic of fiscal stimulus in the US and whether the idea can be applied in Europe as well. In a few minutes, we will hear presentations of Claudia Sahm, Adam Posen, Alfred Kammer, Antonia Diaz, and Daniel Gross. My name is Christian Breuer. I am Editor-in-Chief of Intereconomics, where view of European economic policy. Intereconomics co-hosts this session together with CEPS and EconPol. We are very happy about this cooperation because CEPS, as well as EconPol, like us, are interested in quite topical and policy-oriented topics, particularly on fiscal policy. Just to add, our co-host EconPol Europe, the European Network for Economic and Fiscal Policy Research, is a network of 14 policy-oriented universities and research institutes across 12 countries. It provides evidence-based policy advice to inform the economic and fiscal policy debate in Europe. And this is what we want to do today. Just to note to our guests, we want to provide first speeches of every speaker, 7 minutes each. Then we will have a discussion, and later on we have the opportunity to take a Q&A. You can ask us questions. There is a Q&A function. We will try to pick some of your questions and try to answer your questions later. Further, it should be possible to raise your hand in case you later on might like to ask a question personally, and we can show you per video. This is the idea of this conference, of this session. We have 90 minutes altogether. The first speaker is Claudia Sahm. I will introduce each speaker first. Claudia is an American economist, a senior fellow at the Jane Family Institute. She was formerly Director of Macroeconomic Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth and a section chief at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. She conducts research in macroeconomics with a focus on business cycles, fiscal stimulus, and consumer behavior. Outside the academic audience, Sahm is known for the Sahm rule for identifying recessions in real time, also known as the Sahm recession indicator. Good morning, Claudia.
Morning. Thank you so much for having me today. So I want to jump right into what I see as the lessons from U.S. fiscal policy. I certainly see them as lessons for U.S. policymakers, and happy to share the wisdom abroad as well and learn a lot from European and other countries' response. So I truly believe that this moment is the moment we should take to reflect on the economic policy lessons of the COVID crisis and take steps, legislative, administrative steps, to put those lessons in a place where they will prepare us for the next crisis. Now, I see this as urgent. I think it's underappreciated. I mean, we do have a lot of policies that need to be pushed right now, but we know there will be another recession. We know there will be another crisis. So let's do it now. Let's prepare. Okay, so just as an overview, and I will probably go into more detail on all of this as, we have a 90-minute conversation. So, but I want to make sure that you get like my main takeaways right up front. So I see 3 key lessons from the COVID crisis. First, we need to recognize that COVID as an economic crisis had features that were different than past recessions, and there are features that are similar to past recessions. We saw a lot of discussion right when the pandemic started, and I fully agree that shutting down the economy, trying to keep us from dying, like this was different than before, right? We didn't have a pandemic except, back in the early 1900s. So true. And it did cause some, what economists refer to as supply side disruptions, right? And to some extent, we didn't want people spending a lot of money, particularly going face to face. There were plenty of things people could spend money on, like their rent, their mortgages, but we didn't. It was a very different kind of crisis. One of my biggest frustrations as a macro policy expert was that economists, many of my peers, really grabbed onto this is so different. But really, there were a lot of similarities. Unemployment skyrocketed. People lost income. The Census Bureau estimates that half of all U.S. families lost income from employment last year. Only about a fifth of them got unemployment benefits. So this crisis had a much broader effect on people's finances. But frankly, this happens in any recession to some extent. And we know in the United States, and frankly, this is not unique to the United States, that the hardship of a recession is borne by some groups much more than others. So in the United States, we see Black and brown people being really hit hard. I mean, frankly, they're hit hard by the economy in good times too. And young adults who are coming out into the labor market, and people with less education, less bargaining power at work, just not jobs that were on a living wage before this, and then they got less livable. So we need to keep that in focus, because those features that are the same that we see again and again across recessions and across recoveries, which tend to, jobs come back a lot slower than GDP, that's the piece we can prepare for next time, right? Where, we should, public health measures on pandemic, yes, but like if we think about the economics. The second main point is, in this crisis, our policy systems, particularly how we get money out the door, how we support people, failed. They were put under an enormous test, but we knew going into this crisis, one key example in the United States is the unemployment insurance system. It was in severe disrepair with its technology. I mean, this is inexcusable. We have Silicon Valley. The United States is a leader in technology. Our unemployment benefit systems were coded in programming language that basically only a set of retiree programmers know, right? So this was inexcusable. It took weeks, sometimes months, for the jobless to get their first benefit checks. Most people in the United States can't live months without their paychecks. So that was a real problem. We know how to fix this. This is not that hard. It does require money, and it requires a focus. And frankly, there are parts of the country, unemployment benefits are administered at the state level, that have much less generous, much harder to access benefits. In some case, it's a policy decision. We're going to see in the next month and a half, 25 states, half of US states, shut down the federal enhancements, federally paid for enhancements of jobless benefits. These were in the relief package. They were highly debated at the time, but they passed, and they're being undone in half of the country. That has a lot of things we need to unpack there, but it just shows when states administer benefits, which can be totally fine. Different parts of the US have different contexts, different needs, just like different parts of Europe, right? So it's not that this is a bad approach, it's just the way it's rolling out is causing a lot of problems. And we need to reflect on that. And lastly, and I have a lot more to say on this, but I'm going to respect the time limits on the intro. It's really time for us to reflect on our macroeconomic frameworks and tools. Keep the best ideas out of the old frameworks. Like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Keep a robust dialogue going between like old school, new school thinking. But as just one example, and I have written about this at Bloomberg Opinion, and I feel very strongly about it, our metrics of success, like the output gap, they either need to go or they need to be fixed. So one aspect, I mean, the potential output as a concept was developed in the 1960s at the Kennedy Council of Economic Advisors. I think we've lost the history of where this came from and how it was part of a full employment debate. And economists went off in this direction, which was not about jobs. And in those, to determine potential output, we have to make an assumption about how much work, how many hours there are to give in the economy, often adjusted for how productive those hours are. The assumption that the Congressional Budget Office makes, and the Federal Reserve does this too, this is not a dig on the CBO, is they assume that in 2005, the United States was at full employment. They use demographic groups, age groups, education, actually demographics, race, age. In 2005, the Black unemployment rate was at 10% in the United States. The idea that we are going to call it mission accomplished when we're at 10% Black unemployment is inhumane. And we know, if we talk about current estimates, in 2019, the United States had an unemployment rate of 3.5%, percentage points lower than 2005. If the CBO were to update that assumption, that output gap that Larry Summers, Olivier Blanchard talks about, well, like, we're in a whole different ballgame, because that, even just recognizing where we were pre-pandemic, that says a lot about how much we could achieve. We are nowhere near. But these are things we should debate. I'd never read the appendix of the CBO construction of potential output. We're all learning as we go along. I am frustrated by people taking sides and teams, and frankly, some of the dialogue among macroeconomists has gotten pretty absurd and name calling, and that's just beside the point. But we got to have our fun. We're macroeconomists. Anyway, so those are the 3 points I wanted to make as an intro. So thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. This is great. I think the output gap debate is in Europe very pronounced as well, not only Adam Tooze, but also in Europe, Philipp Heimberger, for example, discussed controversial the output gap debate. The next speaker, should we have a short interaction now, or should we just go ahead with the next speaker? What do you think? If there's no need for a brief interaction now, then I would suggest we go ahead with the next speaker, which is Adam Posen. Adam is an American economist and president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. His research focuses on macroeconomic policy, the financial crisis, and central banking issues. His most cited publication include the books Restoring Japan's Economic Growth and Inflation Targeting, Lessons from the International Experience. That would be very interesting to know from Adam what he thinks about the recent experience with fiscal stimulus.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thanks to CEPS and EconPol for having me as part of this panel. I want to start in a similar place to Claudia. I agree with her about the output gap and various other invisible, non-directly observable measures as a driver of policy has been a mistake. You kindly mentioned my 98 book, Restoring Japan's Economic Growth, and that actually started the attack on official sector output gaps, repeatedly underestimating and assuming that the trend down in a recession was a part of the estimate, and also attacked the idea that that fiscal austerity or even just simple fiscal inaction were the right response to a recession. And so while, of course, I don't take credit for what's happened now, I do say that I've been on this line for a while, and it's very heartening to see the US, and in particular the Biden administration, take the response they did. As my colleague Jason Furman has pointed out, you compare what the Biden administration did in 2020 to what we did in 2008 or 2010, and it is striking in scale, in speed, in content. And of course, 2020 was under the Trump administration, but was done mostly by Congress and Speaker Pelosi. So on that level, I think the idea that we don't try to fine-tune policies to these abstract images, and we don't try to fine-tune policies of fiscal policy to the concerns about debt for large advanced economies which issue debt in their own currency, I think these carry through. And that continues to be relevant for the Euro area. DG ECFIN at the Commission, even Klaus Regling at the ESM, others have shifted a lot from where they were in 2008 in Europe. And I give them credit. It may have been wrong in 2008, but let's give them credit for changing their attitude and changing, more importantly, their policy statements and guidance. Fiscal activism is not a bad thing. Large-scale fiscal action is not a bad thing, and recessions do not have to be accepted. I have a feeling pretty much everyone on this panel will agree with all that. So now let me get a little more specific about some other EU-US comparisons and what the Biden administration has done so far. The first point is, as many of us have made, including John Pisani-Ferry just this week, I think, in a Project Syndicate column, and Claudia made some reference to this, the US was playing catch up. The US did not have a sufficient welfare state. The US does not have a sufficient set of automatic stabilizers. The US has a paltry public sector. And as a result, a lot of what was put in 2020 and 2021 was ad hoc making up for these failings. And one can get more interesting and creative and think about the comparative labor market response that in much of Europe, the emphasis was on furloughs and Kurzarbeit and paid work or part-time work that remained linked to the employer, as opposed to the US, where the emphasis was on layoffs and separations in order to get unemployment insurance. And I think, we don't know yet, but my strong hypothesis is that in the short run, Europe was wise to go the route it did and not create additional frictional unemployment, and the apparatus of unemployment insurance and forced separation to get the unemployment in the US was deficient. That said, the place where both US and Europe remain problematic is on the fiscal side, is I think in three areas. First, that the scale of federal response in both entities remains too low. It's obviously very different to speak of federal response in Europe because that means Europe-wide. And we can, as my colleague Jacob Kierkegaard, call it a Hamiltonian moment that we have this new set of fiscal sharing in Europe and issuance of Euro-level bonds. I'm not going to call them Euro bonds, but Euro-level bonds. But the similarity remains between the US and Europe, that at the level of the monetary zone, there is insufficient automatic stabilization and insufficient transfers between regions. And no matter how you slice it, that's just a fact. The second point that remains an issue in my view is going with the automatic stabilizers. And this is a place I may be a little closer to Blanchard and Summers than some of the other folks who I usually align with. There has to be some credible sense that you are going to pick up taxes in the out years, in the better years, in the future. And that is partly an institutional matter and partly a political matter. But either way, what we have in the US and in Europe is a failure to credibly create a cyclical response on both ends. And that's what I mean about automatic stabilizers being insufficient. It's on both sides. Again, as with Claudia, that doesn't mean that I always assume that the output gap is about to be closed and we need to immediately start collecting more taxes. One would have to come up with a labor market-based cycle or some kind of lagging indicator cycle rather than some forward-looking prognostication about an unobservable on the output gap. I've also posited in the past doing countercyclical taxes on real estate, which also has financial stability benefits. But anyway, we need to beef it up on both sides. Third point is one of governance. And this is, of course, very different between the US and Europe. My colleagues, Pisani-Ferry, Zettelmeyer, Blanchard, Alvaro, and others have made a number of recent proposals, including with some of the people on this call. But in the end, European governance is actually less at risk, in my view, than the US governance. This isn't merely a matter of January 6th insurrection, although I think that's important. The US has repeatedly been unable, due to Republican obstructionism, to pass any sort of long-term budget or to reliably raise taxes when needed. And I'm not sure how to fix this, to be perfectly honest, but I think it has to be seen for what it is, that this is something more akin to Italy or Argentina in the 70s and 80s, or is getting there. Not hyperinflation, but the breakdown of governance. Finally, a plea that we should be doing bottom-up budgeting, decide what it is we need to spend for, such as some of the unemployment measures Claudia rightly points out were needed in the US, for climate change and so on, and then raise the taxes to meet it. As Jacob Kierkegaard and I pointed out in a collection we did for the DG ECFIN on historical fiscal episodes in the US, that's usually how it's gone in the US, is that you do something, you spend, whether it's for construction or war or welfare state, and then you find the money for it. And I think that that has to be the way forward, particularly as we face climate change as well as other humane issues. Thank you very much.
That's an important point. Thank you, Adam. The next speaker is Alfred Kammer. Alfred Kammer is the director of the European Department at the International Monetary Fund. Since August last year, he was previously the chief of staff of the Office of the Managing Director, working closely with former managing directors Christine Lagarde and more recently with Kristalina Georgieva. Alfred, thank you for being with us.
Good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for the invitation. Let me give a bit of a perspective on our views of on the European side, and really focus my remarks on what policies are needed right now at the current juncture, coming out of the, I would say, immediate part of the crisis, where we're fighting the pandemic, including with lockdown measures, and where we are now moving into a recovery phase with vaccinations more and more in place. Let me start by saying that in our view, the policy response so far at both the national and the European levels has been incredibly successful. The monetary and financial policy response helped prevent financial markets from seizing up as the pandemic struck. It kept credit, the lifeblood of the economy, flowing. So very important that this happened. And at the same time, the topic we are discussing today, fiscal support for workers and businesses, helped prevent a massive rise in unemployment and the cascading of bankruptcies. This has, to a large extent, preserved the fabric and the structure of the economy in the face of massive uncertainty. And the job retention schemes maintained this relationship between workers and jobs, so that is helpful in limiting scarring. Household disposable income in 2020 was broadly unchanged from 2019. That was also a result of the fiscal intervention. Now, with vaccine rollouts accelerating, the prospects for a return to something approximating normalcy look good. But the economy will not just snap back to its pre-pandemic form. We saw a snapback in the third quarter last year, but we have been way too long into this crisis to expect something very similar in the second half of this year. There will be shifts in the structure of the economy, partly driven by deeper technological and environmental changes, and clearly policies must help facilitate these transitions. So what we see is, as lockdowns end, spending on generalized support, for instance, job retention schemes, will automatically decline. They're really demand-driven, and that is also one advantage of these programs in place. However, given that European labor markets are typically less flexible than those in the US, and social safety nets are more robust, as Adam pointed out, there is a greater need for supply-side oriented spending to accelerate the recovery. This argues for replacing some of the automatic decline in spending on lifelines with spending aimed at facilitating the flow of labor and the flow of capital out of declining sectors and into expanding and new ones. Higher spending on things like training for displaced workers, alongside incentives for hiring and investment in expanding on new sectors, can do a lot to facilitate the necessary flows and minimize the long-term costs of the pandemic, what we call scarring. This should be supplemented with targeted transfers to vulnerable households that are more likely to suffer income losses as emergency lifelines are wound down. There is, as we pointed out, also a need for more equity support for viable firms. We estimate for Europe a solvency gap for enterprises of between 2 to 3% of GDP. And that needs to be closed in order to help enterprises during the next phase. Viable enterprises, I should say. And those enterprises which are not viable, we need to help liquidation through bankruptcy procedures, out-of-court debt proceedings in order to get them out of the system. Earlier this spring, we calculated that a package of measures along these lines over 21-22 would boost GDP in 22 by 2 percentage points and could cut medium-term output losses relative to the pre-pandemic trend in Europe by more than half. So in our view, this is incredibly important. After the success with maintaining the structure of the economy through lifelines, now in the next step to really focus on the reallocation of labor and capital in order to have a robust recovery and reduce or eliminate altogether medium-term scarring from this crisis. Since the spring, a number of countries have introduced further fiscal support packages. While much of these packages have been geared towards extending lifelines in the face of renewed lockdowns, they also contain elements that will support the reallocation of factors. For example, Germany's supplemental budget of 1.7% of GDP expanded subsidies for apprenticeships and increased grants allocated to firms, as well as provided a one-off boost to basic income support. In Italy, a significant chunk of the 2% of GDP fiscal package approved recently will provide grants to businesses and additional one-off support for workers in hard-hit industries like tourism. These measures are clearly welcome, but as the recovery gets underway, they should be complemented by further efforts to help workers transition to new careers. We must also ensure the young and the low-skilled workers are not left behind. And the young, women, low-skilled workers very much employed in contact-intensive industries was particularly hurt during the current crisis. France's recovery plan provides some good examples of such policies. It offers subsidized training to workers in job retention schemes. It expands funding for training targeted at low-skilled youth, one of the groups most affected by the crisis. And it introduces a program of hiring subsidies for younger workers to help get them into the labor market. Of course, fiscal policy alone is not the answer. Labor and product markets in Europe are generally more rigid than those of the US, and European firms lack access to venture capital and other forms of financing that many US firms enjoy. These shortcomings will also inhibit the capacity of European economies to respond to the shifts in the economic landscape. Structural reforms to address these problems are long overdue, and they are even more critical now. Higher spending, including debt financed by the Next Generation EU fund, should be a catalyst and not a substitute for structural reforms. As it will take time for these reforms to bear fruit, it is important to start making progress on them now. We also cannot ignore the impact of the crisis had on government debt levels, especially in those countries that entered the pandemic with already elevated debt ratios. Once a robust expansion is firmly in place, high debt countries will need to embark on a path of gradual but steady fiscal adjustment. As Claudia pointed out, this is necessary because we need to help restore fiscal buffers to respond to future shocks. In many high debt countries, the growth impact of a gradual adjustment will be mitigated over the next few years as EU recovery funds bolster spending. Making the composition of fiscal policy greener, more growth-friendly and inclusive would also help. The impact of the crisis on government debt also has implications for the EU fiscal rules. The current framework suffers from excessive complexity, poor transparency, and weak compliance. Moreover, a strict application of the current rules once the general escape clause in the rules is deactivated would require unfeasibly large fiscal tightening in high debt countries. Hence, now, while the escape clause is activated, would be a good time to reform the rules. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Then we just go ahead with the next speaker, which is Antonia Diaz. Antonia is professor at the Carlos III University of Madrid and member of the EconPol Research Network. Her research covers topics related to macroeconomics, growth, wealth and income distribution, with a special focus on housing. Thank you for being here. You are still muted, Antonia.
Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. I am very happy. So let me try to say following. First of all, I would like to point out that, yes, this, you can hear me, isn't it? Okay. That, yes, this crisis is a little bit different from the others because this is a shock and demand, supply and demand shocks at the same time. But at the European level, it's important to understand that although it can be thought as a very different sectoral shocks, affecting tourism more than, telecommunications, the fact that economic integration fosters and enhances sectoral specialization across Europe implies that this shock affects some economies and regions more than others. And we should take that into account when thinking about European policy, and that's something that is already built in the way the US is approaching the policy to tackle this crisis. The other second difference between the US and Europe that we should take into account, although Andrew was making me think about it, is that, of course, the US is a country. And because it's a country, it's clear what powers rely on the federal government, which powers are in the state governments, but also they have an architecture about how the private risk-sharing mechanisms, financial system, credit system, interact with public institutions, the welfare system. You may like it or not, but they have an architecture already there in place. And we are a federation in the making. So that's important because that's different in the way we are tackling issues. So for instance, in the European Union right now, stabilization policy tools are at the country, rely at the country level. So you think of it, the European countries, they have already spent a lot of to fight the corona crisis. So for instance, in Spain, we have already 10% of GDP committed to fighting the crisis, using all these forlorn mechanisms to try to keep firms from, shutting down, etc., etc. Also health expenditures, blah, blah. So the way I want to think about the European funds that are coming is that they are not really stabilization policy tools. They are tools designed to enhance a structural change because we have a huge technological change coming in, and we need to face that. But also we need to use this opportunity. I think that the European Union authorities are realizing that, to strengthen our institutions and the institutions that are needed to actually improve our private risk-sharing mechanisms. Just put it shortly, we really need to work on now using having a common safe asset, a European common safe asset, so that we can improve our banking integration, our create better financial markets, equity markets, etc., etc. So in that way, we are in a different institutional stage, and just because of that, the effects of fiscal policy is going to be different. Even when we think about spillovers of regional fiscal policies are different, because in the European Union, we still have coordination problems, and therefore we cannot fight all possible negative externalities, and we cannot exploit all positive externalities that we may have together. So I think it's different than the position in the European Union and the US is that they are right now, because if you think of it, the Next Generation Fund actually it's not a stabilization tool. It's something that is pre-stabilization. It's a type of fund that we are needed to coordinate better. So when we engage in coordinated stabilization policy, so it's really more effective. Okay. So the second thing that I want to think about, and I think that we can really learn from the US, and I think the Next Generation Funds is an opportunity to do so, is industrial policy. The way I like to read the Next Generation Fund is an industrial policy tool. Because you think of it, when we are thinking of which sector we should incentivize, which other sectors we think that they are declining. This is a thought of industrial policy. But the thing is that the industrial policy should be coordinated at the European level. Otherwise, we are losing a lot of externalities. We are losing a lot of spillovers, and we should act as that. So one example in which this is important, just think of it as the Union is thinking about how taxing all these digital firms. And even the Biden administration is saying, no, I don't like that. So they are threatening to, to do things if the European Union wants to tax unilaterally these digital firms. So we need to really get together in that and think of it. So then the things that we should focus from the European side right now, because you Andrew were saying, and also Claudia, is that welfare state here is more comprehensive than in the US. Is that to think about how we are going to coordinate the countries' actions financed by these funds, how we are going to tackle the standing economic and institutional imbalances that we have, how we are going to exploit all these regional comparative advantages and enhance positive spillovers, and think about the two main policies that I think that we should think in common: industrial policy, health policies, aside how to coordinate the stabilization policies at the European level. Think of the unemployment subsidy program that we are thinking of, and at the country level. But finally, I think that the most important thing that we need to think about, and for that also I think we need the cooperation with the US, is tax policy. Tax policy, corporate taxation is the main industrial tool that a country has. So we need to really work on that. For that we need to also to talk to the US when we want to think about taxing these digital firms. But I would like to think about, we can take bolder steps. Suppose that we can have a unique corporate taxation in Europe, okay? And use that as our revenues to finance targeted policies that are delegated to the European Commission. That would be the long-term goal for me, if we are thinking of that. So I think I'm going to stop here and just leave for the further discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Antonia. This is very reasonable. I think there's a lot of discussion going on how to improve the fiscal institution in Europe, provide federal institutions and so on. Thank you. The last speaker for the first 7-minute speech is Daniel Gross. I briefly introduce Daniel. He is a member of the board and distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies, CEPS. He joined CEPS in 1986 and has been the director of CEPS from 2000 to 2020. Prior to joining CEPS, Daniel worked at the IMF and at the European Commission, for example, as an advisor to the Delors Committee, I just read, that developed the plans for the euro. So it would be very interesting to hear your views. Daniel, thank you for being here.
Thanks a lot for this kind introduction. It's a pleasure to join all these distinguished colleagues today. Let me come back to the macroeconomic side of the story and emphasize 2 points. I would argue that this recession and recovery is different. It's of course not different in the sense that unemployment has gone up as it does in every recession, but it is different in the drivers of the recession. As other people said, people did not consume not because they didn't have income, but just because they couldn't either not even work or because they couldn't consume. And that means we should look at the role of fiscal policy differently. I presume we all agree and that governments in these circumstances had one primary task, which was to provide people with substitution income, to make sure that people wouldn't basically be unable to consume and survive just because they lost their job because of COVID or because other indirect effects of COVID. And as was said earlier, the governments have actually been rather successful in this. Somebody mentioned earlier that on average, actually, personal income have not fallen. I would add actually that the income distribution has not deteriorated. For the United States, for which I've seen the numbers for 2020, actually the Gini coefficient of income after taxes and transfers has improved. So in this sense, this crisis, although it had a differential impact on the earnings opportunities on the labor market for different groups. In the end, taking into account the way the government has distributed replacement income, income inequality has not worsened in Europe and maybe has actually improved in the United States. Now, coming back to what it means to have this sectoral recession. So we have a few sectors which are totally compressed and other sectors which are operating close to normal capacity. And therefore, the question we should ask ourselves right now is, all this stuff is now behind us, the restrictions are being lifted, and people are going back to normal, not immediately, but gradually. So some lingering effects might still be existing. Fewer visits to restaurants, less travel, and so on. Now, what should our fiscal policy be under these circumstances? I would say, given that the driving causes of this recession were different, maybe we don't need aggregate demand support. We need, of course, a continuing replacement income, but as compared to last time, we don't have many over-indebted consumers. We don't have firms which have balance sheet constraints because we went into this recession without having accumulated high domestic imbalances. Our usually justification for providing aggregate demand support is that we have cash-constrained consumers who cannot really consume as much as they would like to, and they are not able to get credit in the market because there are financial frictions there. This time around, the financial frictions are really very low, and therefore the argument for having further support to aggregate demand once the sectoral problems have been resolved is not really needed. And I think this view of the sectoral nature of this recession also provides a useful outlook on the concept of output gap, which Claudia mentioned, I think Adam as well. It might be the case that as of 2019, the measured output gap in the US and in Europe were not close to the real ones, right? As whoever wants to define that. That is not my concern. My concern is to say when we snap back to the previous output level, maybe we haven't closed the output gap, but we should be in a similar situation also in terms of the need for fiscal policy as in 2019. In Europe, in 2019, the revealed preference of policymakers was that at that level of unemployment and the measured output gap, and we can discuss whether it was a correct measure or not, but at that measure of the output gap, that budgets were more or less in balance. Right? If we get back to that situation, so a similar measured output gap, what is the case for having substantially higher deficits as compared to 2019? So maybe, as I said, the output gap might be different and might be mismeasured, but the key question is, what is different, let's say in 2021, when the output gap is close to the previous level, that makes us believe that at that point, we need massive additional stimulus. That is my main concern.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I just looked it up just because there was so much discussion about the output gap, and I just checked the numbers of the OECD economic outlook from May. We have an estimated output gap of 1 percentage point in the US this year, and an estimated output gap of 4 percentage points in France and of 7 percentage points in Spain. Just for your information, I know that this measure is controversial and so on. Previously, we were discussing a little bit how we will construct the further discussion. We want to have more interaction, and I would like, and I try to stick to this approach, I would like to focus first of all on the United States. We have a natural experiment. We have this is a rare thing in economics, which is why we should try to focus on what happens there and whether we can find kind of positive theory. Maybe we can even agree on a kind of positive theory. What is the multiplier? What is the size of the stimulus? And later on discuss whether we can apply this to Europe or whether this is normatively wishful. That's why my first question is going to Claudia, which because she was discussing the US program very much in detail. Claudia, what do you think? Is there a consensus of how the size of the stimulus program? 1.9 billion is always mentioned. What is it in relation to GDP? Do you think there's a consensus about that? Larry Summers was discussing a lot of numbers. Would be really interesting to get some insights from you.
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, there's never a consensus among macroeconomists. I think there are good reasons for that. We never get to see the other world, the counterfactual, right? So we can argue about this forever, and we will. So what I would say, okay, so first of all, over the year of the COVID crisis, the United States, the Congress put somewhere between 5 and 6 trillion, depends how much of the Federal Reserve stuff you count, the funding from Congress, into the economy. The US economy is a $21 trillion economy. Getting close to that's a lot of money in a year. Okay, I firmly believe that this was the right policy. And to me, the most important one, or actually I'll put it this way, the one that surprised me in a happy way the most was the rescue package, the one that just passed. And I will say, and this is a little bit contrary to Daniel, but to me, the big policy failing, and the thing I didn't think we were going to learn, was the recovery, staying the course. It is true, the 2008 recovery, like the factors were so different. There was so much going on in the US economy going in the world economy going into the crisis that was just a mess. And yet, the 2001 recession in the United States was also what we refer to as a jobless recovery, right? So this idea that it takes us longer to get workers back to work before our aggregate output gets back, and the 2001 recovery was, or 2001 recession was nothing compared to what we saw in 2008 and 2020. So staying the course, getting everyone to the finish line is something that we have not done ever. And so to me, that last one was the biggie, and it was a full-on fight among policy advisors. And, you know, I have been very open about my criticisms of Larry Summers' opinions on it. I read all of his stuff. I listen to all of it. I think, and yes, he has thrown a lot of numbers around, and I've thrown them right back. And I think it's a healthy debate. But I have been very active. I mean, for over a decade in the research about stimulus checks. I was very active in these last $1,400 checks. I think they're good policy, not just to support an economic recovery, getting people back to work. I think that's totally fine, or is very important. I think there's an aspect of economic relief, like helping families who were still suffering. And many of those people who are suffering were not sitting in Congress or in the boardroom at the Federal Reserve. So I think this has been, because COVID was so horrible and it touched every single person in some way, I think we got to this discussion with the rescue package. And frankly, I mean, I was surprised it passed, and it almost passed exactly like what he asked for. Like, this never happens. It was a fight, and frankly, we didn't win. 25 states are undoing a key part of the rescue package within the next month and a half. But, you know, like, we made some progress, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I do think this is a big, and we are nowhere near a consensus, and we're nowhere near even the metrics. And like, it's going to be a mess for the next 10 years figuring out what we just did. But we're having that conversation, and really that conversation was missing after the Great Recession among or there wasn't enough of it, in my opinion.
Okay, anybody likes to interact here with some focus on the US stimulus package? Adam, do you have an opinion about that? No. Okay, so sad.
Let me just,
sorry. Daniel, did you say something?
I just want to say, my remarks were not about 2020, right? My remarks were about going forward, right? Especially, let's say, second half of this year and 2022, right? What do we need there when the aggregate output has snapped back to the previous level?
Yeah, this is a quite interesting point. I mean, do we think that aggregate output snaps back to the previous levels without any kind of stimulus, or is there kind of destruction through this shock?
You're asking me, or?
Yes, no, I'm just asking back. Yes, okay.
I don't know what, as Claudia said, the counterfactual is very difficult to get. I mean, we know all the figures about the fraction of spent of the various stimulus checks that's in the past, right? And we also know that if we have a deficit, I think, of 15% of GDP or so, then if you apply a multiplier of 1, that theoretically should lead us to a growth rate of, I don't know, 15% of GDP going forward. I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, but this is basically exactly the question. Can we, do we believe that the multiplier will be 1 in this during this stimulus package in 2021, particularly where we have this huge package, and and will it boost GDP so much, or will we just see like a small upswing to potential GDP? I mean, the question is, of course, whether this will be inflationary. So, Daniel, yes, you can just.
On inflation, I don't have a particular insight, but my view is that the economy is operating now close to potential. Whatever, in the long term, the potential might increase by appropriate policies, but in the short run, I think this potential is limited. Just want to tell you that Alfred had asked to intervene.
Indeed, sorry, exactly, Alfred.
Yeah, just one word of caution then comparing these fiscal packages between the US and the European countries. First of all, when you look at just the discretionary the spending that really doesn't capture what is going on in terms of automatic stabilizers, which happen in Europe. But even when you look at the primary balances, even there you don't get a good idea about the fiscal impulse and a good idea about the impact of these policies, because in Europe, a lot of the support happened below the line by providing guarantees, liquidity through companies. When you're looking, our analysis shows when you're looking at outcomes in 2020 and the different outcomes between the US and the European Union, the fiscal response doesn't really play a big role. Largely, what explains the difference is pandemic hit US and Europe differently. The measures in terms of lockdown, in terms of restrictions, impacted the economy differently, much more the EU than the US. That also reflects that in US, teleworking was much more prevalent than it was in Europe. And of course, not to forget about, and that has been mentioned by Antonia already, in Europe, you have a large number of countries which are tourism dependent and were hit particularly hard, something which the NGEU transfer mechanism tries to take into account. So when you're comparing Germany, Poland to the US in terms of growth outcome in 2020, you don't really see much of a difference. So I think that's something important to take into account. And even in 21, just looking at the fiscal intervention, one needs to be careful because, again, the pandemic had a very different impact on EU Q1 outcomes than it had in the US. In the US, the recovery just started a lot earlier. The European Union was hit again by a third wave of infections in the first quarter. Lockdown restrictions are still in impact. Vaccination is slower taking place in the EU. And again, that holds back the recovery in the European Union. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. It's not just the fiscal intervention which makes a difference in terms of outcome. It also makes a difference structure of the economy and also the impact on the pandemic.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine. Antonia or Claudia, you wanted to say something as well? Antonia, or?
Go ahead.
Sorry, first Antonia, then Claudia. Okay.
So I was thinking about the size of the fiscal multiplier. I think that for me, it's hard to think about that because all the estimates I've seen, they are based, first of all, typically in the US in something that I would call normal times. And so anyway, so perhaps if we extrapolate, that's going to be hard. One thing that I think is different from other times is that this connection with inflation. There's this whole worry about inflation coming back, and I just don't see it. When I see countries where wages, labor shares are falling as percentage of GDP, So what I see is that we have wage deflation, not wage inflation. So typically, that's a huge channel that typically when you have that output growth translated into inflation, when coming through wages. And right now that channel is not really working because of the structural reasons affecting our economies and how markets are behaving. So that's one of the things that I wanted to say. And the second one is that I agree with Daniel that perhaps we're back in those income levels. I hope so, because typically because there is a lot of small firms in the European Union compared to the US, and they are relying more on banking instead of equity markets. So for them, it's so much more difficult to recover from a long recession like this, and therefore employment. So, well, I would like to be as optimistic as you, but that I don't know. Thanks.
Claudia.
Yeah, so I will totally amplify the last thing you said about the full employment. So I have lots of thoughts about the output gap, the multiplier, the blah, blah, blah. Again, these are estimates and we can argue about these all day. I think the reality, and definitely in the United States, is we're down. We are missing 8 million jobs relative to before COVID. The United States was in a good place. Could be better. There was still a lot of inequality and suffering in February of 2020, but let's get real, right? 2021, 2022, these are crucial. And it's not just about getting people back to work safely. It's about avoiding the scarring. We have people who have been out of work for well over a year. We know this is detrimental. In the United States, it's a lot of women. And there's a lot of research then on interrupted careers of women just throwing the whole thing off, right? So I think there's an urgency in the United States. The relief package, the relief is going through September, except for states that are undercutting it. So I do think we've had a debate about 2021. I think the Federal Reserve has also shifted to a jobs metric of where we are. I mean, they always watch inflation. It's absolutely absurd to say the Fed is asleep at the wheel on inflation, but they've really shifted their messaging in a way probably the White House would have been anyways, but jobs, getting those people back to work. And I think that's a really healthy thing. I think that could be moving us towards metrics that are grounded in the real world. And frankly, the people grasp. Because it's their lives. The reason we fight recessions is because people lose jobs, and that's horrible, and it's suffering for these individuals. So I think the discussion about jobs added in, again, let's keep talking about multipliers, and because we need effective policy. The debt that is being racked up right now is immense, right? I think it's appropriate for the immense crisis we've faced, but we do need to do it as effectively as possible and know when to trigger it off, right? That's a big part of the automatic stabilizers is to know, but we have to come to some kind of agreement, and we're far away from it. But I love the point about the labor market. That's really important too.
Yes, I learned a lot in the last comments also by Alfred, and because I think there's indeed a difference between Europe and the US. You have a higher automatic stabilizers in Europe, so that's why maybe you don't need so much fiscal stimulus additionally, while the role of the state, just particularly in protecting people who are unemployed in the US, is not so big. So that's why you might need, particularly in this specific crisis, a bit more social protection or additional stimulus, I can imagine. Daniel is raising his hand. Daniel.
I disagree on this point. When Europe has more automatic stabilizers, that means, of course, it means less discretionary action by fiscal authorities to provide replacement income. It does not necessarily mean that the US needs a higher overall deficit.
No, exactly. That's what I wanted to. I think that was exactly what Alfred mentioned, and I wanted to highlight here. And I thought that because Adam, for example, in the beginning also discussed the differences between the US and Europe, maybe this explains some of these differences, that we in Europe might not be so keen on higher stimulus.
May I say one word on this one?
Yes.
If one wants to put it in a nutshell, much of the Biden package actually is trying to replicate the effects the European social system has in a crisis like this, in order to provide support to the population. That's the strength of the European system, and that's really the difference between the US in terms of providing this social safety net, which doesn't exist to the same extent in the US. I think one point I wanted to make is where Europe usually falls short is in the next part of the phase of the crisis, and that is the US usually is excelling in terms of flexibility into reallocating labor in the economy, reallocating capital in the economy. And I think that needs to be a focus of European policies, because that's usually where Europe is falling short, and policymakers now need to pay attention to that. That doesn't preclude, I should say, that we may still need aggregate demand support, because there is a lot of slack in the labor market, despite all of the programs in place, despite all of the income replacement that has taken place. And in the end, the focus should be to come back to eliminate the economic scarring from this crisis and come back to pre-trend growth levels. So that should be at this stage the focus. And we have been estimating that actually the permanent loss so far, based on the policies in place, permanent output loss by 2025 is 1.5% of GDP, which is much lower than in many other recessions, including the great financial crisis, where there was a difference of 12 percentage points. Yes, that pre-crisis growth may not have been sustainable, but the scarring to a large extent so far has been prevented. But it depends also on the next step, to make sure that we have this located labor getting to new employment. And I think that needs to have the focus. That's a supply side measure, but we also may need some aggregate demand support. We don't know yet.
What kind of measures in detail would you suggest, and maybe we find a consensus on those measures for Europe, for example?
When you're looking at labor displacements, one of the tools which are used by a number of countries, including the UK, are hiring subsidies in order to move labor from sectors and firms which are no longer expanding into the other sectors. An important part of the packages need to be retraining, reskilling of workers. That is a much longer term issue as well, because when we are thinking about the objectives of the Europeans to digitalize, to move on the green economy, there will be a lot of transformation. And if you want to make sure that this is going smoothly, and that nobody is left behind as part of these transformative reforms, you need to have programs in order to retrain, reskill labor. We have been discussing this before the crisis, because of automation, because of advancement in technology, etc., that we need more of these programs. This crisis has emphasized this part, and this is not just a now issue with regard to this crisis, the retraining, the reskilling. This needs to be a permanent part where we actually step up the game and become better, in order not to have people left behind after dislocation.
And Adam, did you say something, or no? Anybody else?
Let me just comment on one aspect, which was that the Biden package just replicates the European welfare state. In that case, it would not be a one-off thing, it would be permanent, I presume. The difference is that if the US wants to have European or close to European welfare expenditure, does it not need also close to European tax rates? I mean, Adam seems to agree, but they don't seem to be in sight.
Adam, you have to unmute yourself. No?
Okay,
Oh,
sorry.
yes.
I've mostly been agreeing with what people have been saying, so I saw no need to open my mouth.
All
But
right.
on this point about taxation, look, we can always fixate on the fact that the U.S. For at least a century has basically kept the combined state and local taxation at roughly the same share of GDP. And the public debate, particularly pursued by the Republican Party in the post-war period, so last 75 years, has chosen to make the fiscal policy about tax rates. In the end, one has to deal with the realities, and one has to try to get the public debate to deal with the realities, which is there are very good returns in both human ethical way and long-term growth ways of having higher taxes that are used to pay for other things. And the US having a miserly circumscribed welfare state because of our history of racism and sexism and regionalism is costing us and costing the world. And there, one can give up, or one can say, and particularly in a world where the political system is breaking down and where we did have this somewhat ad hoc but very large shift in fiscal policy, and where the threat of climate change and the need for massive public investment and adjustment assistance is imminent, that we do otherwise. And so while the title of this conversation, Kristen, as you and the Ideas Lab put it together, is Lessons from the US to EU, as I wrote in my article in Foreign Affairs last month, it's time for the US to be taking lessons from others, to import reform just as many countries did from the US in the past, and raise itself to international standards. And I say this to American audiences as well as to European audiences. I'm not just pandering. And that is where we have to go. And the fact that at the moment, the particular configuration of senators in the US Senate do not recognize this reality doesn't mean that we can stop pushing for a better reality.
Is this the game of chicken approach to fiscal policy?
Danny, you always try to sneeringly reduce everything to a sharp remark. This is actually a long-term debate. This is a long-term effort where all the evidence is on this side, and we have serious political issues to deal with. And they are historic, and they are anti-democratic, and it's not about reducing it to a game of chicken or some small institutional fiddle. If anything has been made clear by the last 20 years, it's all the precious notions of classic economist political economy about the power of constitutions and nudges and incentives and constitutional political economy in the Tabellini person mode were completely disproven, because we had a bunch of things that were common across countries, irrespective of the institutional arrangements, and we had a bunch of complete shifts in what the institutions produced in a time series sense in the US and in the UK. Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry to go off on this, but this is serious business. This isn't about just, is it a game of chicken?
Yeah. My remark was not meant to be sneering. It is a very serious issue, I totally agree. But there's still an element of two very large opposing forces.
No, there's not. There's an element of one well-organized fascist force, and then a very disparate group that is unable to get organized and is being prevented from exercising electoral power. Yeah. So no, the chicken characterization is incorrect.
So if I could jump in,
yes, of course.
Because I absolutely agree on the urgency. And the importance, as much as I said, I want us to reflect on what we just learned to fight the last recession, it is absolutely essential that we really put all of our economic thinking and firepower into what comes next in terms of structural fiscal policy, particularly in the United States, has been neglected for decades. And for a lot of reasons, and I will agree, I mean, the political, I really hate Washington, D.C. The political discourse really does get into barbs, and in any case, so I get it, like both sides of these comments, right? And this is sadly where a lot of this goes. Just wait, tomorrow's jobs day in the United States. We find out about May jobs, and I forecasted that tomorrow all the numbers are going to be weaponized by both sides. So, and I think that's a pretty reliable forecast. But what I'm not sure I'm optimistic, but what the Biden administration, the Democrats in Congress, and if Stacey Abrams and the other organizers in Georgia had not done what they did, we would not be having this conversation, right? So this is on very thin margins, are with what's called the jobs plan and the families plan, both of which are in Biden's budget. These are about long-term structural investments in our physical infrastructure and in our people. What passed in the rescue plan and what is in the families plan is essentially guaranteed income for children. Right? Like we have a sea change in fiscal policy happening. The reality is Biden has until the midterms to pass it. Right? FDR had like 4 terms to do all of his New Deal policies. The dysfunction of politics, political economy in the United States is we've got very little time. So we'll see. But I do think it's the policy proposals are there, and we are actually having a debate, and there is a live, like there are votes, but it is it's really depressing to watch. Like it really, really is. And there is a lot of point scoring, even if not amongst experts here, but there really is a lot of point scoring, and it's very frustrating. But, we're having the debate. There's some good policies on the table. There's some less good policies, but the United States does need to catch up and lead, especially on climate change. And I am really excited about the potential for these global minimum taxes. I mean, that's another like long shot, but the fact that we're even making any progress, because like we really are all in this together, right? Like there are national interests and context, but especially on our biggest problems, like this, we're going to do as well as the least fortunate among us. Like that's just the reality. So.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you. I also wanted to ask if you have at least you mentioned the infrastructure investment package, and you mentioned that there's so much disagreement also in Washington on these several packages. But as you know, there's a lot of disagreement in Europe as well. I mean, you can complain about US policy, but in Europe we also have a lot of disagreement if you try to find a consensus among 27 heads of state and try to find a common tax code or a common infrastructure, or what Antonia mentioned, a common, what did you say, a safe asset. And if you want to agree on an investment program at the European level, which could be quite reasonable probably, and this could be maybe something what we could learn from the US, this is difficult as well. Which approach should we take here? To everybody. Sorry, Antonia, probably you are the right one. Since you
you're talking about the European Union.
Yes.
In my view, right now, I think that we need to build consensus, different consensus, and across European Union members, but not vis-a-vis Spain versus Germany, etc., etc. So we need to recognize that we have different consensus with different type of groups in countries like, green technologies. Some firms in those sectors should be speaking and coordinating with the other similar sectors in other countries, workers in some other sectors. So there's going to be transversal consensus that had to be built up. we need to work in that direction, because at the end of the day, I think that our problem is having the political will to really work on that, because once I have started thinking about all these issues about the European Union problems, and then you go to European Commission webpage, you find a lot of studies. You find a lot of estimates of all these proposed policies, to improve corporate taxation in European Union, etc. So we know the solutions. They are already there. We know the estimates of what's going to happen if we apply them. So what we are lacking right now is the political will and the political balances to put them in place. That I think, and the only thing, the way to go is to really think about, cross-sectional consensus, across countries, not just thinking of in national terms. As I said, Spain versus Germany, France versus, I don't know. It has to be in a different way. Okay, so and I think this is going to be important, because I think that the big debate in the next years is going to be the fiscal debate, and because of many reasons, is that we have piling up a lot of public debt in many countries, and we are piling up debt. We have been reducing taxes to many people and corporations, and because of the economic structure, many wages have been reducing. So we need we find that we need to support economically all this, to income support to a lot of people. So, and again, public debt is going on. And many firms are not paying their due share to support public goods and institutions. For instance, there is a paper by some professors in the University of Wisconsin. You added the offshore profits of all these multinational firms in the US, you will add 2 points of GDP in the national accounts of US GDP, just by including profits. Okay, so we are talking about a lot, and that, and that applies also to Europe. So we need to join efforts on this. Okay, and I think that's the big question right now. Yeah.
Yes, I can imagine coordination in Europe is very complex and difficult as well. If we cannot just increase tax rates for corporations. We have very low tax rates, for example, Luxembourg. We don't find a consensus on all these things. Now we want to probably discuss the reform of the fiscal compact, as Alfred suggested earlier. We have next year election in France. We have this year structural deficits in France of 6 percentage points. Next year, 4 percentage points. What should Macron do? How can he find a consensus, organize a consensus to increase or to avoid further austerity measures, at least in the context of the elections in France, for example? Any idea about that? I mean, you have to find a consensus, as far as I understood, in Europe. How will you do it? How will you convince the Frugal Four and even Viktor Orban, finally, if you want that?
Maybe let me come back to Antonia's initial point in terms of building the architecture in Europe, and building up the architecture of a union with 27 sovereign states is, of course, very, very difficult. But as Antonia mentioned, the Next Generation EU Fund was a big success. And beyond just a sign of solidarity, when you're thinking about transfer payments in grant forms of up to 14% to countries which have been impacted, particularly by the crisis and are low income, this is a huge fiscal transfers which is taking place. And the second and important part, of course, is it's supporting the structural transformation of the European Union, and by doing this can actually increase productivity and potential GDP over the medium term. So I would say this instrument has been a big success in terms of getting it together, and also in terms of its design. And we see that countries are actually very sincere and very eager to make the implementation of the national recovery plans a success. But what it also signals is that the architecture is still not complete. I mentioned before the issue of capital as an issue for firms and companies getting out of the crisis. So Europe still needs to build up and complete the capital and the capital markets union and its banking union. And when we are talking about the fiscal rules, we need to redesign them because they have not been successful in terms of being good over the cycle. We saw expansion during fiscal expansion during bad times, and we did not see consolidation during the good times. And that in the end hurts if you're not building the fiscal buffers for the next crisis. And we know the next crisis is going to come. And we also have suggested as part of that to think about a central fiscal capacity, which is a counter-cyclical instrument in that. And is not like the Next Generation EU fund, but it is would be progress on the fiscal side. And that's something as part of the architecture discussion Europe needs to tackle and Europe needs to take seriously, and we need to make progress on.
Thank you. This is a nice proposal. Anybody wants to reply to this proposal? I just thought about Q&A. I did not find any questions so far in the Q&A from the audience. If anybody has a question, just write it.
If I can just add one point on the fiscal rules, which I think Alfred alluded to, but perhaps it needs some amplifying. If there's one thing we have learned with this recession is that the distribution of output is very skewed. Very large shocks occur more often perhaps than we thought beforehand, especially very large negative shocks. And we have also seen that if you are in such a situation when the shock comes, if you're already burdened with very large debt, then your room for maneuver is very limited. And that, I think, is a reason to be prudent. Whatever the difference between real growth rates and interest rates, which with respect to the pre-COVID period, I don't think has changed a lot. But what should have changed, in my mind at least, is realization that basically large shocks come around more often than we thought. And one way to make our fiscal policy sustainable, a word which is very often used, is to reduce debt levels.
Someone else on this?
So,
Antonia?
oh, go ahead.
No, sorry, Antonia or Claudia?
All right, I'll go first, and then
yes,
you're,
thank you. Yes,
you're up.
right. Yes.
Yeah, so I absolutely understand the discussion about fiscal space and when it's appropriate to take the foot off the gas or put the foot on the gas. I do think that one lesson from the last recession and Europe, you all barely learned, like this caused bigger problems outside of the United States than inside, was fiscal austerity, right? And so there is a moment where we need to pay down some of the debt, but we also need, like, we are in an extremely low interest rate environment. We have seen productivity growth slow. We do not want to be in the same situation that Japan has been in for decades now, because it is not an easy place to get out of. So we need to be careful, right? There is a time and a place, but it's not before we are recovered, because that cycle has caused a lot of damage. And I know this is very contentious, and I know there are different views on different sides of the ocean here, but I think in the United States, particularly with the policymakers that are at the wheels right now, there is a real understanding that stopping too soon will have consequences for generations to come. So that, and I'm encouraged by that, but there are risks. There are risks to that, like, for sure. But I think, frankly, it's time for us to take those risks.
Antonia.
Okay, I was having a look to some numbers. So,
but
in the
we will have
US,
to close soon. But you have but keep it
2
brief.
more
But
minutes.
you should do
Government
that.
debt as percentage of GDP in the US is something like what, 100%?
Yeah, something like, I think, yes.
In the European Union as a whole is lower than that.
Really.
So, but of course, there are many differences across countries. So what I'm trying to say is that the current scheme of fiscal surveillance in the European Union is not good to give incentives to different countries to tackle the issue of their public debt and to work on building a good fiscal system. So that's not helping. So we need to think that design, that coordination design in the European Union. If we really want to help countries to, like mine, to reduce public debt in a way that it does not hurt long-term growth perspectives. That's it.
Great.
I'm done.
Thank you. I take this as a last comment because we reached our time budget. It's 5 o'clock. We have I promised to close this session in time. I need to thank all the speakers for being here. Thank you, Claudia, Adam, Alfred, Antonia, Daniel. It was a pleasure to lead you through this session. We have to thank all the other institutions and people who worked to make this possible. Thanks to CEPS, thanks to Veselina Georgieva from CEPS, Jeffer Bourguignon from Intereconomics, Matthias Dolz from EconPol, Cynthia Alcide. Thanks to everybody who attended, and I hope you enjoyed. I'm sure we still have a lot to discuss further because this is an open and ongoing discussion. This experiment will go on in US and in Europe as well. So I'm looking forward to do this in the future. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Bye.
Bye.